The title of this book, The Spiritual Man, we are in chapter 1 of the Great Part 3, chapter 1, subpart 6, chapter 1, subpart 6, chapter 1 of this Great Part 3, subpart 6, chapter 1, Deliverance from Sin and the Soul Life, chapter 1, subpart 6. Now, spirit and soul are easily to distinguish in experience. Spiritual life is maintained simply by heeding the direction of the spirit intuition. If a believer walks according to God's spirit, he will not originate or regulate anything. He will instead walk quietly for the voice of the Holy Spirit to be heard in his spirit intuitively and assume for himself the position of a subordinate. Upon hearing the inner voice, he rises up to walk, obeying the direction of intuition. By so walking, the believer remains a steadfast follower. The Holy Spirit alone is the originator. Moreover, he is not self-dependent. He does not employ his voice in executing God's will. Whenever action is required, the believer approaches God intently, fully conscious of his wickedness, and petition God to give him a promise. Having received God's promise, he then acts, counting the power of the Holy Spirit as his. In an attitude such as this, God will surely grant power according to his word. Precisely, the opposite is the soulish life. Self is the center here. When a Christian is said to be soulish, he is walking according to self. Everything originated from himself. He is governed not by the voice of the Holy Spirit in the inner man, but rather by the thought, decision, and desire of his outer man. Even his feeling of joy arises from having his own wish satisfied. It will be recalled that the body was said to be the shell of the soul, which in turn form the shield of the spirit. As the holy place is outside the Holy of Holies, so the soul is outside the spirit. In such intimate proximity, how easy it is for the spirit to be influenced by the soul. The soul has indeed been delivered from the tyranny of the body. It is controlled no longer by the lust of the flesh, but a similar separation of the spirit from the control of the soul has not yet occurred in the soulish Christian. Before the believer had overcome his fleshly lust, his soul had been joined partner with his body. They together constitute one enormous life, the other nature. As it was with soul and body, so it is now with his spirit and his soul. The spirit is merged with the soul. The former provides the power, while the latter gives either, with the result that his spirit is too often affected by his soul. Because it is surrounded by the soul in court, even buried therein, the spirit is stimulated easily by the mind. A born-again person ought to possess unspeakable peace in the spirit. Unfortunately, this tranquility is disturbed by the stimulating lust from the soul with its numerous independent desire and thought. Sometimes the joy which flood the soul overflow into the spirit, inducing the believer to think he is the happiest person in the world. At other times, sorrow pervades and he becomes the most unhappy person. A foolish Christian frequently encounters such experiences. This is because the spirit and the soul remain undivided. They need to be split asunder. When such believer hears some teaching on the division of spirit and soul, they will like very much to know where their spirit is. They may search diligently, but they are unable to sense the presence of their spirit. Without any real experience, they naturally are at a loss how to distinguish their spirit from their soul. Since these two are so closely linked, it is common for them to treat soulish experience, such as joy, vision, love, etc., as superlative spiritual ones. Before a saint arrives at the stage of spirituality, he is sure to be dwelling in a mixed condition, not content with a quietude in his spirit. He will seek a joyous feeling. In his daily living, the believer sometimes will follow the leading of intuitive knowledge and sometimes his thought, sensation, or wish. Such a mixture of spirit and soul reveal that two antithetical sources reside in the believer. One belongs to God, one belongs to man. One is of the spirit, the other is of himself. One is intuitive, the other rational. One is supernatural, the other natural. One belongs to the spirit, the other belongs to the soul. If the child of God carefully examines himself beneath the beam of God's light, he will perceive the two kinds of power within him. He likewise will recognize that sometimes he lives by the one life and at other time by the others. On the one hand, he knew he must walk in faith by trusting in the Holy Spirit. On the other hand, he referred to walking according to himself on the basis of what he termed spiritual feelings. He lived far more in the soul than in the spirit. The degree of his soulishness varied according to, first, his understanding of the spirit life with its principle of cooperating with God, and second, his actual yielding to the soul life. He lived far more in the soul than in the spirit. The degree of his soulishness varied according to, first, his understanding of the spirit life with its principle of cooperating with God, and second, his actual yielding to the soul life. He can live entirely in an emotional, irrational, or activist world, or he can even live alternatively by his soul and by his spirit. Unless he is instructed by God through the revelation of the Holy Spirit in his spirit, he shall be unable to abhor the soulish life and to love the spirit life. With whichever life he chooses determine the path he shall follow. Unless he is instructed by God through the revelation of the Holy Spirit in his spirit, he shall be unable to abhor the soulish life and to love the spirit life. Whichever life he chooses determines the path he should follow. End of chapter 1 of this part 3 of this book. End of chapter 1 of this part 3 of this book. Now we enter in chapter 2. Chapter 2, the experience of soulish believer. Chapter 2, experience of soulish believer. The life of soulish believer. The soul varies inevitably from person to person. It cannot be stereotyped. Each of us has his particular individuality, a uniqueness which will extend on into eternity. It is not destroyed at our regeneration. Otherwise, in the eternity to come, life, in the eternity to come, life will be most colorless. Indeed, now since there is this variation in the soul of all men, it naturally follows that the life of soulish believer will likewise vary from person to person. Consequently, we can speak here only in general terms and shall merely present the more prominent feature against which God's children may then compare their experiences. Soulish believers are inordinately curious. For example, simply for the sake of knowing what the future holds, do they try to satisfy their curiosity by studying throughout the prophecy of the Bible. Carnal Christians tend to show off their differences and superiority in clothing, speech, or deed. They desire to shock people into a recognition of all their undertaking. Of course, such a tendency may have been there before conversion, but they find it hard ever afterward to overcome this natural propensity. Unlike spiritual Christians, who seek not so much the explanation as the experience of being one with God, these believers look diligently for an understanding in their mind. They like to argue and to reason. Failure of their life experience to catch up with their idea is not what worries them. It is their inability to understand this lack of spiritual experience which troubles them. They conjecture that knowing mentally is possessing experimentally. This is a tremendous deception. Most soulish believers assume an attitude of self-righteousness, that often it is scarcely detectable. They hold tenaciously to their minute opinion. It is doubtless correct to hold fast the basic and essential doctrine of the Bible, but certainly we can afford to grant other latitude on many points. We may have the conviction that what we believe is absolute right, yet for us to swallow a kernel but also to strength out in it is not at all pleasant to the Lord. We ought to lay aside the small differences and pursue the common objective. At times, the mind of soulish Christian is assaulted by the evil spirit. Once their thinking becomes confused, mixed, and sometimes defy. In their conversation, they frequently answer what is not asked. Their mind runs wide. They shift their topic of discussion ever so often, proving how scattered are their thoughts. Even when they pray and read the Bible, their mind wanders far away. Although these Christians usually act